All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We have 20 people online. We had about 38 registered, so I'm hoping a few more pop in as we go. There was a mix of ag professionals, farmers, and industry people that were in there. So a very good mix of people to have some really good discussion here with Gerry, and I keep calling him Gerry, and so I'm going to try very hard to call him by his proper name, but if I mess it up, he told me it's okay. He's been called worse, so I'll just roll with it. So this is the first of a three-part series that we're doing leading into our community of practice work. We finally got funded by the ministry, yay, to do some of this community of practice. And so the idea is to dive a little bit deeper. During our needs assessment, we heard about farm family dynamics as being a problem, and with our counseling program, that's what we're getting from our counseling feedback from our counselors, that a lot of the people are reaching out for support is around farm families and the dynamics of dealing with wellness and well-being in rural communities. So we have another webinar happening on February 13th. If you haven't heard of it, it'll be Patty Durand, and so she has a lot of experience working with hundreds of Canadian farm families through farm transition discussions, and so she has some insights on what are some of our traditions and some of the things people are getting stuck on. And then we also have on March 26th, Diane McKenzie, who's from here in Alberta, and she'll share her research on farm family dynamics, looking at succession through the lenses of gender, business, labor, and rural culture. And being a woman farmer, I find that a very good topic to talk about. So we encourage you to participate actively in today's discussion by submitting your questions and comments in the chat. And my friend Andrew here is going to be moderating the chat. If he feels that the question needs to interrupt the flow of conversation, he's going to interrupt us. And otherwise, we'll add that to the discussion at the end of the webinar. So we're going to try and save, not try. Andrew told me I wasn't allowed to say try. We are going to save 10 to 15 minutes for the end of the conversation for you guys to join us. And so you should be able to unmute your mic at the end. This is a recorded webinar. And because it's recorded, we don't want to invade anybody's privacy. So if you can just keep your mics off so there's no interference while we're having our discussion, and then when we open them up at the end, that'd be great. And please don't forget to fill out our evaluation, and to help encourage you to get in there and fill out the 6 or 7 questions that are in our evaluation. We're going to give away 3 of Gerry's books today. I almost did it. 3 of Gerry's books to the first 3 people that fill out our evaluation. So Andrew will be sharing that link in the chat if it isn't already. I think it's already in there.
They're all probably leaving right now to fill out the evaluation.
Please, it's only, I know what time. I can see what time. If you fill it out at the beginning, you're not going to get it. So end of the day. That's what we're doing. So anyway, before we get too far down the road of too many other things, I'm ready to have a conversation. How are you doing, Gerry?
I'm doing well, and I'm really excited about this, Linda. Thank you very much for the invitation. And like I said before, a lot of people signed on. I would love to see everybody's faces because, of course, it's always more fun interacting with people when, in fact, you can only interact when you see people, but you and Andrew will do at this point.
Yes, I'm sorry. We've been trying to troubleshoot all of these new settings in Teams. So next time, because I'm sure we'll have you again, because I think you have a lot to share. So I've been reading your book. I haven't quite got all the way to the end, and it's been really awesome. Like, I'm reading it and I'm seeing my own family in there. I'm seeing people that I know in there. There's a lot of anecdotes, and that really brings out the story of how people are experiencing rural life right now here in Canada. But you didn't set out to be an author. So I'm going to ask you the hard question up front. Why'd you write this book, Gerry?
That is a hard question, Linda, because I still don't have a clear answer for that. I didn't set out to be an author, and someone called me an author the other day, and I said, well, I don't really think I am one. Be that as it may, and of course, as most of you might know by now, I used to farm. And while I was farming in 2004, I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and thus began a journey which continues today, quite frankly. I've learned a lot over the years. I've been involved in a lot of stuff. In 2010, someone suggested I should write a blog, and so I did that on a weekly basis. And then I thought of, well, I could compile those into a book, but really, when I read some of them, they really weren't worth the paper they were written on. So, and then someone else, I told them a story about my farming days, and they said, well, you should write a book. And long story short, eventually I sat down and I started writing, and out came a book. And so, yeah, I like the comment you made about reading it, Linda, and reflecting. And I've had lots of comments from people, farmers and non-farmers, saying, you know what, I read the book. I see my own journey in your journey, and that's what I love about this, because it enhances conversation. It helps us have conversations like this. And I still maintain that when I started talking publicly about my journey in 2010, people would approach me, and in those conversations, I learned so much, and I hope in retrospect that they learned a lot too, because we learn from each other, and it helps us on our journeys.
Yeah, that's so true. That's what I like most about the work that I have been doing over my life too, is interacting with people and hearing their stories. And those little tidbits that you get when you talk to someone are really can be really shape what you think and how you interact. Um, there's a couple, well, one thing that stood out in the book, I think, well, there's lots of things that stood out in the book, but one thing that I really resonated with was the story about the Chinese tires and how Chinese tires impacted your bottom line and your stress on farm. And I was like, oh, that happens so much. And that's something that's kind of unique in the agriculture industry. And it's something that, I don't know. Do you want to share the story? Because you'll tell it better
Well,
than me. I'll forget things, but
if I can remember the exact details of it, but it goes back to, again, when I had hogs, and we had risk management programs, and you're sitting at the farm, you're trying to figure out how you can make your farm financially viable by using risk management programs. So of course I would watch the markets, because you could forward contract hogs, and then I would read market reports. And this one day I was just awestruck, I guess, because I I better understood that the people that were controlling the markets had no idea what a hog was, and yet the moves they were making were in fact influencing the price I was getting. And the story you're referring to, Linda, was the Americans back then, and this goes back a number of years ago, were going to put a tariff on incoming Chinese or Chinese manufactured tires. And the Chinese, in return, then decided, well, then they were going to put a tariff on chicken parts going to China, which then these market people decided, well, now that we're going to have a glut of chicken parts in the States. And so the consumer will go to chicken parts or chicken meat because it's cheaper. And so they're going to leave the pork products on the shelf. And so pork products won't have a good price. And so therefore, the price I was going to get for pigs wasn't going to be as good as it should be. And that's the circle we go around.
yep,
And I
yep.
mean, we're going to talk, I'm sure we're going to talk about farm stress. And I was just talking to someone about this yesterday, is these things outside of our control, and yet our livelihoods depend on it. And if that's not stressful, well, nothing is really.
Well, and something I hear from people in other industries all the time is, how is that any different than me in oil and gas or in forestry? My comment on that is that farms are typically, so far in Alberta and in Western Canada, they're small businesses. We are very small businesses. There's a lot of cash flow that might go through it, but it's a small business. And so the impact of something like a trade action like that on our bottom line and how it impacts a number of businesses can be huge. When you think of forestry, maybe they're diversified, or oil and gas, they can diversify, they can shift things around. It's really hard for a mid-size or farm, a viable farm, to just shift into something instantly. And especially, I mean, you got a whole barn full of pigs. What are you going to do? You can't just
Well,
shift, right? Yeah.
yeah, and exactly. And I was going to say that. And again, I believe I tell this story in the book too, is some years ago, my wife and I were down in the Dominican Republic, and I was wearing a T-shirt to the beach that said "Thank a Farmer" on it, and I was approached by someone actually from BC who was quite perturbed that we have to thank farmers. Why weren't people thanking him? And he, I can't remember what his business was, but he said, I have a tough time making ends meet too. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with a relative, a plumber actually, who was kind of going down my throat for the same reason. And I said, well, the difference is you're a plumber, you've got a warehouse full of toilets you want to sell. If the price isn't good, guess what? You can sit on them. Well, when my hog is ready to go to market, I can't sit on it. It has to go. And so we're kind of forced sometimes to make these decisions and to forced to market our things. And that goes with things like grain as well, because the granaries are full and there's a harvest coming in, or whatever the case may be. But there is that component to the agricultural community.
Yeah, and I mean, on the grain side, it's really hard when we have a rail strike, right? We can't move that grain, so we have no cash flow to put in the next crop, and we have no space for it anyway, even if we could, right? And so grain storage becomes one of those trigger issues that is a huge concern and financial burden to try. So it's in every part of agriculture, and it's because of the
Absolutely.
size. Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
absolutely. Yeah. So it's like the most recent one that I could think of example of the same thing would have been that Chinese um, executive that was exported to the US and that crashed the canola markets, right? And
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
just
And
crazy.
and it seems like these events, and we had a workshop last fall, and you know what, there was a threat of rail strike, and the fact that even the rail shut down for a day in preparation for that, how much money was lost, and like you say, created concerns. Or the canola market thing. Well, now, right now, all the farmers in Canada are concerned about these 25% tariffs that are looming, and what kind of havoc that might create with their livelihood. And it's a livelihood we're talking about. So it's
Well,
tough.
yeah, and it's different. Like if you have a bigger companies can really lobby the government really effectively for those buyouts and those help. Like the Packers during BSE, they got help. They did well through BSE, but the mid-sized farmers to get together and the amount of effort and um, activity it would take to actually pull something together so that you could get that support and that your position is known by the people that are managing the situation is really difficult. And so like
Yeah,
not having that voice also adds to that. It's that other element of farm stress. And I know that's a key trigger for when we talk about regulations. So you hear people like, what's bothering you? It's regulations and uncontrollable circumstances. These are the kinds of things that show up that maybe not everybody has the in-depth understanding of. But then there's also how to deal with those as far as like how active you are on boards and that kind of thing. So I was really impressed in your book. You ended up building a barn that you built just you built it and you didn't really know about pigs and that's a pretty big investment and you build this barn, you fill it with pigs, and then you end up as the president of Manitoba Pork. I mean, that's a lot of work being that having that role as the chairperson of those kind of marketing boards, and then to go through from single desk marketing into open market. I mean, that was a huge transition for our pork producers, and a lot of people lost their farms during that transition. So maybe speak a little bit about that experience. How, like, I feel like there's a tension between participating and being active and building that community and having that encouragement of being with other farmers that are going through the similar thing as you. But on the other side, it's responsibility, it's time away from family, it's maybe a commitment of time and expense to be there, to be that chairperson and have that voice. So that seems to be a lot of what your story, there's a lot of those little bits happening in your story. Can you speak to that or give us some insight on that?
yeah, and it's interesting because when I look back on my life, number one is I grew up on a turkey and grain farm. Never had any interest in farming. and certainly would never have considered building a hog barn. My uncle had a hog barn across the road from us, and quite frankly, the smells and noises coming from there had nothing to pique my interest for that. But the opportunity came, I jumped into it. The opportunity came to get involved in what I call agricultural politics, and so I did that. And I think, quite frankly, and there's a chapter in there, and if there's Mennonites on here, my apologies if I say something that offends you, but quite frankly, I grew up in a fundamental Mennonite home. My father was the pastor of a Mennonite church, and so you're supposed to be in the world but not of the world, I think is what they say. And so I never had too much exposure to that outside world. I started getting involved in these things, and again and again, another chapter in my book, I talk about my imposter syndrome and the fact that I never felt like I fit in, and so that made it so much more difficult. And so, yeah, I took on these different roles, and I think that really contributed to eventually what was a downfall of my mental health. Although in retrospect, I now understand that started back when I was a teenager, but really came to light later on and drove me, quite frankly, to a significant addiction issue and something I had to deal with just to try and fit in. And, if someone would have told me 10, 15 years ago that I would be sitting here talking to a group primarily from Alberta about a book I had written, I probably would have kept drinking, because it just wouldn't have really fit my persona, right? But I'm happy. Dare I say I'm happy I went through a lot of the challenges I did, because it's made me who I am today, and I am a better person for it, I hope. My wife seems to think so occasionally.
No, that's good. That's that low German, the low German communities in Alberta. I mean, there's a lot of them in agriculture. So from the fundamentalist Mennonite all the way to Hutterites, and it's a segment of our farming population that I think gets neglected. That a lot of the programs and stuff they don't consider them. And so there's a really great program here in Alberta that offers counseling, and they have low German Mennonite options, which is amazing. So, and we actually have had people reaching out for counseling because our program is about agriculture and the stress of agriculture from those communities that they want to get support now. So it's been that's one of the things I really like about the initiative that we're working on and how things are kind of going. So I was really interested to hear and to read about your that part of your life in your book. I grew up around a lot of Low German Mennonites, Hutterites, and Mennonites, and so it was just really it was a good part of the book and something that I think anybody that's counseling, anybody in agriculture might get some insights just even from what you've written in your book.
Well, sorry, Linda, just on that point, I also want to make it clear, though, that, and I've heard from enough people that look back on their life and they blame their upbringing for what they're dealing with today. They blame the church they went to, the school, a school teacher. I certainly don't. That's not my intention to do that. But I also fully understand that all of those things, whether big or small, contributed to what my mental health became, right? And so it's important to recognize that. But if I spend too much time just reflecting on that and blaming everybody back then and my parents aren't alive, it does me no good. So it's just
for sure.
important to understand, be able to move forward from there.
Yeah, and I think it's just really good that we just make sure that we remember all the different kinds of farmers that are out there. We have a very diverse industry and a very diverse population, and you can't just put us all the farmers in a box, right? So I appreciated that part about your book, and it just really helped me get around some of those conversations that I've had in the past. So that was really good. And I found it was really amazing that your brother and your dad were farming together and then they made room and you were able to come into that family farm. Like that's an unusual thing for that to
Well,
happen. So,
I didn't really make room. My dad, it's interesting when I reflect on this, and my dad's been gone for 35 years. I sometimes wish he wasn't gone because I think we could have had really cool conversations about how his career path and mine were somewhat similar. Is that uh, I'll relate a story that's in the book, and I may lose my train of thought here, Linda, so you'll have to bring me back. The
okay.
last year we were farming, I was in Winnipeg on business, and I met my kids. They were all living in Winnipeg, met them for supper. And as I walked into the restaurant, there was a feed salesman in there that I had gotten to know through the hog industry. And he asked me how I was doing, and I told him I was winding down the farm. And I made the comment to him, I don't think I'm a farmer anymore. And his comeback to me was, well, maybe you never were. And so at first it almost felt like a slap on the face, right? But then when I thought about it, I'm going, you know what? I know what he means. And I talk, and I know you and I talked about this, Linda. There's an identity that farmers have. They have this connection to the soil, they have this connection to the livestock they're dealing with. And I wonder perhaps if I never had that. So going back to your question, I think my dad went through a similar thing. He wanted to step away from the farm. So that's what opened the door. Although as part of that meant I had to become a hog farmer, which I did.
It is something that we hear all the time, like even in depopulation situations and stuff, where you're talking to a farmer and they're going through a transition, whether it's like depopulation or farm family or a divorce or whatever the transition is. And they're like, what else am I going to do? This is all that I am, right? And that is a significant barrier, I think, to people moving on is from your experience working in mediation, because you do farm financial debt mediation work as well, right? Would you say that that is a common barrier, and what would you
Oh,
insights do you have about that?
oh, it's so common. I've dealt with over 600 farm families in mediation, and countless times I've heard farmers say, "Well, if I don't farm, what can I do?" And there's two stories to that, Linda. One is that in 2007, when we had wound down the farm, I got involved with the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line, which involved taking intensive counseling, training. My wife took it with me, and one day I was expressing that frustration that when I dealt with farmers, they would keep saying this. And I looked over at my wife when I was saying this, and she was smiling. So on the way home, I said, "So why did you smile when I said that?" And she said, "Gerry, do you know how often you've said that to me?" and so I was portraying the same thing. But the second piece to that is I've also, over the years, as I've dealt with farmers, have had countless farmers who, when I was dealing with them, they didn't want to let go. They had that connection. It was an identity to them. And I often say that identity, when we lose that, we go through the 5 stages of grief. I mean, it's those same steps. And I've had numerous people come back to me 2 3 years after who have moved on and just said, "Oh, why did I hang on so long? I should have moved on sooner." So I keep saying there is life after farming, but it takes some significant effort to get there.
That was one of the lines in your book that really stuck with me, was about how it wasn't a suicidal thought, but you're in the mix of the whole stress and the barn and the cleaning and all the things, and thought, like, the only way out of this is to die. Like, I'm in this, right? And with the financial pressure and everything else on top of it. And it's not suicidal. It's just a realization that once a farmer, always a farmer kind of mentality, right? And it's almost like you have that to death do us part kind of idea when you get into farming, that is, it's so, it lodges in there, and it's so hard to think outside of that. What
It
are some
is.
of the things that you did to get through that? I mean, obviously your counseling training that you did at the distress line helped with that shift,
Well,
or
even back further, like I said, I was involved in this agricultural politics, and I know part of the reason that we had the challenges we did on the farm was the fact that I enjoyed that off-farm work more than I enjoyed farming, which contributed to that. But then in 2000, the Minister of Agriculture appointed me to the Manitoba Farm Mediation Board, which was a real life changer for me because I started doing that work and understood quickly that I had some natural ability to do that. It was interesting work. I enjoyed doing it. And so I started kind of branching off at that time into my own business, which I started in 2006, I believe it was. Um, sorry, what was your question?
I was just wondering what you did to get to
Oh, right.
transition from
And,
farming, like to get out
and
of that
so
mindset.
and so somehow, Linda, that transition kind of started by accident, perhaps. And again, because I don't think I had that same deep connection to the farm that many do. For me, it was easier because while the farm was experiencing the challenges, I was already starting to go down a different path with my career.
And so when you wrapped up the farm, because you were farming with your brother, right? So when you wrapped up, is it the whole farm? Like, is there still a family farm there or the whole thing? So how did that work happen with your brother? Like, was he also in the same place where he was like, I'm done with this? Or is it,
Oh yeah,
yeah.
and we both had this off farm work that we were doing, and we both enjoyed doing that. We had opportunities there, and so we did it. But I know where you're going with this, Linda, and I want to relate a story to you again. Is in 2004, when I went to see the doctor about stuff that was happening. He said, "Well, you're having anxiety attacks, and if it hasn't already, will lead to depression, and put me on medication." I could spend an hour talking to you about medication, but I'm not going to. But then I went a year and a half later, I went off the medication. Some life-changing event happened, which pushed me towards the abyss. And my wife and I decided, well, we should try talk therapy before we do the medication thing. So the first appointment I had was with a psychologist, who after an hour looked at me and he says, "Well, you better go on medication because you can't afford me." And he was absolutely mortified because in my conversation with him, I said, "You know what, man, I need to get rid of the farm. I need to move on." And he could just not come to grips with the fact that I could justify selling the family farm. So did that help my stigma? Did that help the shame I was feeling? Did that help the guilt I was feeling? No, it made it so much worse because and I've talked to lots of family farmers who are under, we'll talk about the fact that the expectation is there that they've taken over the family farm. They need to carry on with the family farm. And if they're not able to, it's a complete failure on their part, and how dare they? And so unfortunately, that's one of the huge stigmas out there.
Yeah, and it's like you say, not just within your own family, but the community at large has that idea, and it makes it really hard to break out of that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. It's so it was the psychologist that had the stigma.
I just told my wife this week, I was talking about that again and said, I sure wish I could remember the guy's name because I'd like to
Have
underline
another
that piece in
conversation.
my book and send him a copy of it, and at the same time
Yeah.
report him to the College of Physicians and whatever. So
But
no,
you know,
I'm not bitter, not at all.
no, no, it doesn't sound like it. But you know, like that just underlines the importance of the farm informed therapy and what we're trying to do and accomplish with Agno and these other initiatives across Canada. Is like we really want people to understand because it is so damaging when those stigmas come out, even from the professionals that we're trying to get help from. And we've learned already at Agno that it's like we want farmers prefer to get help and support from professionals that understand agriculture. That was like 96% of the people that filled out our survey said it was number one important. And it's a huge barrier for people to reach out. And so to know who's the safe person that's going to understand when I start talking about this and I say something as dramatic as I think I need to sell the farm, that can walk you through that. And from our therapists, actually, we heard a lot about how do we refer people if we're dealing with feelings, how do we refer them to somebody that can help them with the facts And then the people that are dealing, the ag business professionals, told us the opposite. They're like, we can deal with the facts, but it gets tied up with the feelings. Like, how can we? So our community of practice work is all about trying to bring those two communities of farm professional or agriculture and foreign professionals together in a community of practice so that we can get those conversations and people get the supports that they need. So I was really impressed in your book how open you were to trying things, and maybe that wasn't the experience. Was that the experience? That was my impression from the book, that you were just open to finding, what can I do next? What is going to make the situation better?
I absolutely, Linda. And quite frankly, after the winter I've had, I could add another chapter to the book because I've learned a lot. I've learned that your typical antidepressants don't work for me because of I'm part of 8% of the population that deals with the certain issue I have, which makes me extra special, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, medication doesn't work for me. There's other things I've tried. There's some natural stuff I've done. And yeah, you know what? I added another new thing in the last month just because I'm ready to try new stuff because it's always I know how much better life is when I'm mentally well, or at least close to being mentally well. And so absolutely I try different things. But there's an important point I want to make here, and that is that for many years when I was seeking out something that would help me, I was hoping for that magic wand, that kaboom, and I'd be fixed.
Yeah.
I was reminded 2 weeks ago by a person I use as a therapist, actually my naturopath, who said, Gerry, it's not one thing that will fix this. It's a culmination of all the little things. So I use a happy light, sad lamp, whatever you want to call it. I have to make sure I exercise. I have to make sure I have protein in the morning. I have to make sure that I get out and connect with people. I have to make sure I disconnect from social media. I just told my brother at noon that I don't watch news anymore because it just drives me around the bend, and it quite frankly doesn't. So I have to be intentional, number one, aware, but then also very intentional with what I do so that I can get up tomorrow morning and face another day.
Yeah. And I like, so we hear from a lot of people in the rural areas, like accessing services and having access to services and therapeutic approaches and all that kind of stuff. And it's quite daunting to try and figure out which service, what kind of person, who should I talk to? It's really daunting when it comes to mental health. And it's a struggle when you don't even have a physician. And a lot of our rural physicians are worked so hard that trying to get the attention that we need in the mental health space is really a challenge, right?
Absolutely, Linda. And going through, and if I look back to 2004 when I first went into this deep hole, I mean, I had a family doctor. I loved the guy. He loved to we would quickly get the medical stuff over with so we could talk about farming because he dabbled in farming as well,
Yeah.
right? But even now, even last fall, when I was looking at the medication thing again, I've had 4 or 5 family doctors over the last 20 years. I mean, when you tell them I feel anxiety or I'm depressed, oh, well, here's a medication for it, right? There's not a lot of questions asked. There's not a lot of talk about the implications and what might happen, what might not happen. And so for a person that's experiencing this darkness, that's overstating it a bit, but even the anxiety or overwhelming stress, they have a difficult time trying to stop. Where do I start? And that's why I'm ecstatic about the work you do, Linda, in Alberta with Agno. We have the Manitoba Farmer Wellness Program in Manitoba, which started 3 years ago. And that's the ag-informed counselors. It's amazing what kind of stuff that can do. Instead of people having to search and try the third, fourth, or fifth opinion, there's now an avenue to get help a lot quicker and more effectively.
Yeah, vetting people so that you have like a narrower scope of people to try first. The three ways that farmers like to get information, and you tell me if this resonates with you, Gary, is Gerry.
Terry.
Oh, Gerry, is that farm informed professional, but then it's also peer to peer, being able to talk to other farmers that have been through something similar. And I think that's just not a farmer thing, that's a people thing. We like to have people with that lived experience. And I think it seems to be something that is especially maybe more relevant in a rural setting than in an urban setting from my discussions that I'm having on the mental health side with more of that urban audience about like how to connect with people in the rural area and being able that peer to peer. And I think that's why it comes out in our surveys and stuff as being so important that it's farm informed therapists and ag professionals. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And again, farmers make up such a small portion of our population, less
Yeah,
than 2% of our
yeah,
population. So everybody knows everybody. I went to Ag Days last week in Brandon, which is the largest agricultural show, whatever. Everybody knows everybody. And so being able to open up about perhaps if we're struggling has been difficult in the past. It still is to a degree. But I started telling my story publicly in 2010. There was very little uptake on it. Not a lot of people would talk to me, but that's changed over the years. And we have these organizations, Do More Ag. We now have the Canadian Centre for Agricultural Wellbeing, national organizations. We have provincial organizations such as yours. And excuse me. And so that awareness is there. And I now actually, when I do presentations to groups, there's actually going to be people that will get up and publicly ask me some fairly personal questions, which is awesome because that means that word is getting out there, awareness is out there, and people are more willing to talk about it. And being able to talk about it in a coffee shop with your neighbor or a fellow farmer, or I can't overstate the importance of being able to do that.
yeah. And the thing is, once you open up just a little bit, you find out that you're in a community of friends, that we're all kind of suffering from the same pressures. I mean, the tire tirade wasn't just on your farm; it was ubiquitous across the nation,
Well,
right? So
and just to give you a little
yeah,
story again, Linda, sorry, I keep going back to stories, but
love it.
just when I was doing the farm debt mediation, and I remember sitting around the kitchen table, in fact, talked to the gentleman this morning, and this happened 15 years ago, maybe, is I was sitting and we were talking about their financial situation, and he pulled out a letter that the credit union had sent him about they were going to start collection activities because the guy wasn't being able to service his debt. And he got quite emotional as he read this. And when he was done reading it to me, I looked at him and I said, "Do you not want to know what I did when I got that same letter?" And his mouth just dropped open and he says, "You know what I'm talking about?" Yeah. And the more we open up to people, the more we're going to find out they know because they're going through the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's one of the challenges that we heard from our ag business professionals is that a lot of them are getting older. And the schools are like the universities and stuff aren't training the same, putting the same kind of emphasis and training and getting those agriculture professionals into the industry. And so there's just fewer and fewer people with that lived experience that can be that helper, right? Yeah, it's a,
But I think that we're turning the tide on that. And you talk about older. Well, I'm not older, I'm old. I'm
okay.
officially old. But I also know that my kids, for example, are way more open to talking about mental health challenges, certainly than I was when I was their age or younger. And so it's good to see that generation is coming along. And in fact, I had my 10-year-old granddaughter, I was going to say niece, granddaughter was here a while ago, and she was feeling stressed out about something, feeling anxious. And I looked at her and I said, "Well, do you know what you have to do with anxiety?" And she said, "Yes, you have to face it. You have to walk towards it." And I just went, isn't that awesome when someone that's 10 years old has that tool, has that knowledge to be able to do that?
Yeah, that's amazing.
If I would have said that to my grandparents, they would have given me a swift kick in the ass and told me to work harder.
Yeah. What are you crying about, right?
Yeah,
No.
exactly. I'll give you a reason to cry.
Yeah. So do you think that there's what are some of the other barriers that you faced in trying to get help? And like what were maybe you have a story for us or something or an example of something that was really helpful when you reached out and something that maybe wasn't as helpful that might be helpful
Well,
to our audience
well,
here.
not helpful is again going back to what I said before. When I've gone to my family doctors and I've loved all of them, I have no complaints about them, but that they're just willing to throw a prescription at you, go on your way without any discussion. And perhaps I'm more of a curious type and I want to know. And so I don't know, I've seen a couple of psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, mental health workers. I've been through the gambit more than once. And then 7 years ago, maybe, I was headed off the rails again. And my family looked at me and says, well, you need to do something. And I'm going, well, what?
Yeah.
Nothing helps.
Yeah.
And then someone suggested a naturopath. And I said, okay, I would, just to appease them, not holding out a lot of hope. But that appointment was an hour and a half appointment, a naturopath with expertise, specialty in mental health. That was the most amazing appointment I ever had. And when I got home from that, my wife looked at me and says, that's the first time you've ever come home from an appointment with a smile on your face. And it wasn't because they fixed me that day, but rather she connected dots for me. And right back from when I was a teenager to now, she could connect dots and exactly tell me, this is what's going on and this is what's happening. And at the end of the day, I understood this. And so by gaining that understanding, I can help myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, going to a naturopath, I have this, and again, going back to my Mennonite upbringing, I'm a meat and potatoes type guy. Don't put anything else on the table, particularly mushrooms or cauliflower. No, just meat and potato. And so I thought going to the naturopath, sure as heck, the first thing they would say is, well, you need to change your diet. But they didn't.
Oh,
You
that's
know,
good.
one of the things, and she talked about the fact that I had a dopamine issue, is she said, and I talked to her, I told her when I get up in the morning, I am often filled with anger. And I'll make up stories in my head to be mad about. I would, if your name popped up, Linda, trust me, within 2 minutes, I'd have a story which wouldn't even be factual, but I'd be really upset with you, which makes no sense. I get it, but that's what happens. And she
Yep.
said, well, you need protein first thing in the morning because protein helps boost your dopamine, which helps get rid of that anger. And so every morning now, and I have religiously for the last 7 years, I have a protein shake every morning when I get up. And it's been interesting how that little step helped.
That's
And
awesome.
so that's kind of what I found helpful. And again, I don't want everybody rushing off to get themselves protein powder to make a protein shake because we're all different. We're all
Different.
different people. We all
Yeah.
have different needs and just be open-minded. And when you go to a doctor, go to a counselor, go to a therapist, make sure you ask questions because by asking questions you can learn and that's what you need to do.
It's really awesome to hear people that actually find that connection finally. And that's, I think, one of the things that we want to communicate is don't give up. If you don't find the service that you need, there's a study that was done in Canada that says we get referred about 5 times through our mental health system before we find the right service. And so it's really important to us at Agno to try to eliminate some of those barriers to try and find those services that we think will align on farm from what we've heard from people and try to get that so it's a smaller pool. Maybe we can eliminate a few of those steps and it could be one or
Yep.
two. But you working in debt mediation, you see a lot of farmers that are in that crisis point, I'm assuming. And do you have any advice on that? Like when somebody's hit that crisis point, they finally like have to, or they're forced to reach out for help. Do you have any advice for people about how to approach that with a farm client?
People as farm advisors or as farmers?
Oh, both. Be broad.
Well, I challenge farmers, and I don't do a lot of debt mediation anymore, but when I do my presentations, I really address how stress impacts our decision making. And on farms, have to make more and more and more decisions. And if we're overwhelmed with stress, it becomes so much more difficult to make. In fact, Farm Management Canada did a study 6, 7, 8 years ago that showed that research shows that farmers that deal with their stress or are stress-free make much more financially viable decisions. And so there's my challenge to farmers is don't be afraid to reach out for help. Get an advisor to come in and sit, not someone that's going to tell you what to do. The last thing we want is someone to tell us what to do, right?
Sure.
But someone that can sit down and go through your plans with you, do a reality check. I sometimes look back at what I did on the farm, and trust me, in my mind, I could make all kinds of things happen, and I would. But what happens is if we sit down with a neutral third party, we can start verbalizing everything that's going on in our heads. And this goes whether you're making farm management decisions or in your own personal life, is when we can verbalize what's going on in our head, a couple of things happen. Number one is you put it out there. Number two is when I do that, I can recognize what's real and what's perceived. And it's interesting how often what comes out of my mouth, absolutely, when I hear myself say it, I go, really, Friesen?
What was I thinking? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's that. And I think as advisors, go out there and be able to have that listening ear. Be empathetic. Don't be sympathetic. Be empathetic. Make that connection with the farmer, just like the story I told about sitting around the kitchen table. It wasn't that I was sitting there having answers, but I was letting the guy talk in a safe place, listening to them, normalizing and validating what they were going through, and in that way, they're actually able to start coming up with their own plans.
That's awesome. That's exactly what we teach in our peer support part of our workshop that we have, is about that empathy piece, being with people in the moment, letting them be heard. I mean, the knowing and being known is so important to anybody's mental health, and it can be so hard in a small rural community if you're suffering and you're isolating yourself from people. It can be really hard. And I think when we look at the suicide issue that is happening in rural Alberta, whenever I do any and talk any about any of our suicide prevention stuff that we are trying to get off the ground here in Agno, the farmers, it just like the whole room, when you're doing that presentation, the whole room just gets silent. And there's just this undercurrent of sort of grief and people looking the other way. And that's when people come up after to talk to you. That's always what they're talking about, is that they know somebody, or they know of somebody, or somebody in their family has been impacted, because they get to that crisis point, and then that's
Yeah, I
to
had a
death
call.
do us part, right?
Yeah, I had a call 2 weeks ago from someone that said, you know what, I have a neighbor. I think my neighbor is struggling. How can I support that neighbor? And then he said, we had a suicide here last year, and we made up our mind that we have to make sure we check in on our neighbors more often.
Yeah.
And that just warmed my heart. And I just go, yes, we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, our suicide prevention stuff is all about that, just normalizing the conversation, giving people the words to step out and ask those questions, because you never know when you can save a life. And it's they say like it's like an 8-minute conversation usually is all it takes to turn people around. So there's a lot of hope in that. So anyway, I have to I said that we weren't going to try. We were going to open things up for conversation. So anybody wants to ask a question, Andrew and I are just learning this part of how to facilitate this part of the discussion. So bear with us if it's a little choppy. But you should be able to unmute yourself. I think you should be able to raise a hand, and I think Andrew possibly might see somebody if they raise a hand, and we can.
Mona just had a great question. So Mona, if you're comfortable and can unmute your mic, it would be great for you to ask it and to get Gerry's perspective, or I can read the question. So Mona asked, what if families were equipped with practical, applicable tools that empower them and were part of a group hearing real life stories, doing exercises and strategies, learning how to transform their family dynamic into one that is supportive, empowering, and capable of tackling the challenges of mental health together? What do you think would happen?
If that was possible, oh wow. The short answer is we'd be in a new world. It would be so awesome to see. But I also know from my experience in dealing, and I don't want to throw cold water on that idea because it is good. But there's so many different dynamics involved. It's a challenge, but again, I think a lot of the tools are out there. It's a matter of using them. And guess what? When you're not mentally well, it's difficult to grab a tool and use it.
So just a little background on Mona. She does Cool Family Solutions. I don't know if you've heard of them. Oh, so they have a program that's peer-to-peer, and it's for supporting families from a family perspective, supporting somebody in your family that has a mental health diagnosis. And so they work in a peer-to-peer. They have tools. They have a really awesome tool, actually. And it's a program that is virtually, and you're across Canada. You can join into some of their peer support groups that get over it from it. And the impact of those is being shown in research. They have a researcher that works with them, and the impact has been incredible. And it's that peer-to-peer connection. You give in the tools, you give in the coaching, and then you have that peer-to-peer. So she does a really good program that way, if anybody's interested in looking into that.
It sounds awesome.
Yeah,
it sounds absolutely awesome. Yeah, for sure.
She's definitely one of the programs that I think is aligned with the values of farmers, and is a program that I think would really work.
And I can tell you from my experience, and I'm very, very thankful for my wife and my kids and the support they've shown. But trust me, the ability to support didn't happen automatically. They had to go through their own process, because initially it was more anger and frustration of, Dad, why the hell are you doing this? Whereas they came to grips with the fact that I had an illness. I was trying like crazy to deal with it, and all they could do was support me and walk with me by doing that. And in my book, I talk about my family invited me out of the closet. I was in the closet with my issues because I felt shame, I felt guilt. I had disappointed them again, and I didn't want to step out of there. And finally, instead of opening the door and yanking me out, they opened the door and invited me out. And that was when I was able to really start moving forward.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah. We hear that a lot with people that are working with someone with an addiction, or yeah, it's really challenging. And you know, the thing about Mona's program that I really resonated with me is that it is a family approach. And so that everybody in the family is like, this is the thing, and you just bring it out of the closet, stick it on the table, we all look at it, and then how do we move forward, right? And it's an amazing approach. And if we can apply that in a broader sense, so it's not just families and not just mental health, I think we'd have really thriving and resilient rural communities. Yeah, that's awesome. Any other questions anybody has for Gerry. They can put them in the chat or unmute if anyone wants to ask any questions. We have some really awesome people that are attending today, so it'd be great if anyone wanted to ask. Maybe your friend Kirk that came on and helped us troubleshoot at the beginning has a question or two for you. But it's been, I've just really been, oh yeah, don't forget the evaluation. Please do the evaluation. And if you have a chance, even if you don't win the book, buy Gerry's book. It's really good. I just am really enjoying reading it. I think Mona read it too, and I think there's someone else that got with
I'm
us.
on
Anyway.
mute.
Oh,
I'm
you
on
did
mute.
it, Mona.
Oh, I see a microphone at the top. I was trying to follow instructions that keep coming across. I read your book, Gerry, and I loved it. It was very, very insightful from your perspective and what your was going through and everything. And I loved the analogies and everything. It really was related. I read the whole book before I came today. It was my mission to get it. I bought it and got it, and I recommend it to anyone. It is so insightful, and I'm so pleased that you wrote the book, and good for you, and the value that you have for yourself of how it was therapeutic and everything else. It was very good.
Thank you, Mona. I really appreciate that.
Well, Gerry, have we kept you long enough?
Can I jump in with a quick question
Yeah,
for Gerry? Because
absolutely.
we met earlier in the week, and for the farmers that are struggling, and we all know somebody, whether it's family, friends, farmer, what are the three things that you mentioned to me the other day that are really important for them to know and remember?
Number one, you are not alone. Number two is it's more than okay to reach out for help. And number three is there's hope and there's relief. And can I tell one more story?
Absolutely.
Because it was incredibly impactful on my journey. And I talked about in 2005 when there was a life event that happened. In fact, I'll tell you what it was. I was on a motorcycle trip with my brother. And no, I'm not a biker. I borrowed my son's bike and went on a bike ride, whatever. I saw him go ass over tea kettle
Oh no.
with his bike. I sometimes tell him he didn't hit his head quite hard enough, but he was in the hospital he was in there for quite a while, but for a week in a coma. And so all the work on the farm was now thrust on my shoulders. And so I remember 3 days after that coming to the barn, I was not in a good place. And my neighbor dropped by and he said, "How are you doing?" And you know how we normally respond by going, "Oh, I'm good. Yeah, surviving, plugging along. Another day in paradise," sarcastic, whatever the case may be. For some strange reason that morning, I started talking. And everything that was going on in my brain, and there was a lot of dark shit going on in there, I just started spewing out. And the guy sat there for an hour. He didn't give me answers. He sat there, he listened, he normalized and validated what I was feeling. And that was an absolute turning point in my journey because that encouraged me, that empowered me to go out and seek even more help. So there's 2 points to this. Number one is if you're dealing with something, you're struggling with something, please talk about it. Please, it's going to help you. And if you're not struggling with something, I know for a fact you have neighbors, friends, family that are. Give them that listening ear. No judgment, safe place to listen, normalize and validate because it's also incredibly helpful.
Gerry, we're just really happy that you were able to join us today. And I think we might have you come back on again. I have more questions I could ask, actually. There was tons of really cool stuff.
How about we set up an event in Alberta and I'll drive out and do it in person?
Oh, that'd be amazing.
I'd love that.
Yeah. We actually are working with Kaiawaka, which is a clothing company out of New Zealand, and they are just coming into Canada, and they have the same motto as us: for farmers by farmers. And so they've reached out to us, and they want to give us 1% of clothing sales. So if anybody's going to Federated Co-op, please check out their clothing line. They're adapting some innovations based on feedback for our Canadian winter. Really good quality clothing, and it's all about farming and for farmers. And they want us to do an event too. So I think Gerry, and I almost said Gary, he didn't, that could be something that we can do as part of that promotion and part of their sponsorship. So that'd be amazing.
I just clicked on chat and I noticed there's some comments there, and I really appreciate all the comments. It's been great chatting with you all, and yeah, let's keep up the good work.
Awesome. I just really appreciate everybody that showed up today. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email, and it'll have the evaluation in there if you didn't click on it yet. Please do the evaluation. It helps us with our funders and telling the story of Agno and what we're trying to accomplish. And again, we have 2 more webinars coming up in this series, and this is leading into the community of practice work, where we're trying to increase the capacity of our mental health and healthcare and our ag professionals to support farmers through some of these issues and concerns that are happening. Yes, Gerry?
If people want to learn more about me and order a book, just go to my website, gerryfriesen.ca. And there's some short interviews, there's a longer interview, there's other stuff on that website you might find of interest. And then there's links to 50 different places you can order a book from, or you can just email me. Yep. So it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, and we put those links in the registration page on our website too. So if you go to agno.ca, go to events, and then click on Gerry, then you should be able to find. Yeah, I did it right. You should be able to find links to all his website and his social media and all that there too. So awesome. Well, thank you everybody for attending, and we'll catch you with Patty Durand on February 13th, right?
You bet.
Yes, February 13th. Great. Thanks, everyone.